Hey y'all, what's up? It's Erik again, the E-Dog. I love that thing. Here to talk to you in this short lecture, second short lecture from chapter 9 in your textbook. Here to talk with you about types of feminism. So we already talked in the first short lecture about the three waves of feminism, and today we're going to dig into each of these different modes of feminism. So the first that we're going to talk about is what we call liberal feminism. And this takes what we call an entryist approach to looking at organizational communication. And so it emphasizes efforts that are aimed at providing ways for women to receive the same professional opportunities as men. So the idea here is not so much that women create their own organizations and women do their own thing, right? Rather, it's about creating opportunities, right? Creating opportunities for women in the existing structure, in existing organizational structure. And so your book gives you an example of the Women's Network that was developed at General Electric, right, as one of these organizations that was founded and put together in hopes of creating career opportunities for women that were commensurate with those enjoyed by men, right? Other efforts that are associated with this kind of liberal feminism are things like parental leave programs. So in the United States, for example, we mandate 24 weeks, not all of which is paid, by the way. But in countries like Spain and France, one might say more civilized European countries, women are allowed 300 weeks of of parental leave after they have a child, right? So you see that there are some big differences in the ways that different cultures look at women's roles in the workplace and the opportunities that should be afforded them, right? Now, one of the problems that we find with parental leave, so if you're at work and you have a child, one of the problems with the notion of parental leave is that a lot of women don't take advantage of it, right? And I should say many men don't take advantage of it as well. And this is because they feel as if they will look bad for their employers, right? That they won't take their careers as seriously as they take their family. They're not as interested in their careers as the other folks around them. And we also know that a lot of these fears are based in reality. We know that women who take advantage of parental leave programs often, that should be often, not offer, often face challenges when it comes time for things like promotion and pay raises and the like, right? So even if they're not penalized directly for taking time off work to have a baby and usher it into the world, they're oftentimes still penalized in ways that are less obvious, right? In ways that are, just less obvious, I guess. So there are, of course, some critiques of liberal feminism. One of which is that it doesn't question the basic structures and assumptions of organizational life. So what they're saying is people who critique liberal feminism on this basis, they're saying that all you're trying to do is give women an opportunity to compete in a world of men, and you're not questioning the problem that exists in the basic structure that enables it to be a world of men and not of women. You're not questioning the structure of it, which is inherently unfair in itself, they would argue, right? Also, it puts the responsibility on women to conform to male-dominated organizational environments, right? It's, sure, women can get hired, but it's up to them to fit in, right? And so a lot of more radical feminists feel that this is deeply unfair, right? It's just not an equitable way of dealing with people. Now, there's also the question of whether or not the women in management approach focuses too much on white middle-class educated women while ignoring women of color and uneducated lower-class workers. So one of the arguments here would be it's nice that you want to make all these advancements that well-educated white women can take advantage of, but what about the rest of us, right? What about opportunities for uneducated women that didn't have the chance to go to college, for example? Or what about opportunities for women of color that have traditionally been denied these kinds of opportunities, right? And then furthermore, they more radical feminists would argue that liberal feminism treats masculinity and femininity as unproblematic. The notion that these ideas that are associated with gender are okay, and we just have to figure out how to deal with them. Your more radical thinkers might say, listen, there's nothing okay about these ideas at all. They're problematic in and of themselves and need to be addressed. So, moving on then to radical feminism. This emerges during the 1960s, and it's what we would call a women-centered narrative, right? So practitioners of radical feminism didn't just want to be able to get jobs in corporations or organizations that were dominated by men. Rather, they wanted to make all new institutions from the ground up, right? So alternative institutional forms that were rooted in women's values. So some of those traditionally feminine qualities, such as, and I'm making air quotes that you can't see right now, such as emotion, nurturance, sensitivity, and connectedness, are reframed in the concept of radical feminism as the basis for an alternative vision of the world that can be built, right? And the argument goes that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So what that means, right, to unpack that quotation, is that radical feminists are saying, look, you can't use the tools to build up a woman's world using the tools that were built to keep us down, right, or used to build the structure that kept us down. So as a result, right, we need to come up with all new institutions, and institutions for women by women, right? And so this is the idea that emerges in the 1960s. So a proponent of this, Audre Lorde, she argued that the very assumptions on which the patriarchy is built are problematic, right, and inherently oppressive to women. So what Lorde is saying here is that the ideas and the notions, the systems, the rituals, the practices that built a world dominated by men are wrong. There's a problem with these ideas, and that they are in and of themselves oppressive to women. And so as a result, right, we need to do our own thing. We need to rethink these assumptions, right? So in general, radical feminism also downplays differences between men and women. I should point that out. So although this seems a little counterintuitive in light of building organizations specifically for women, it should be noted that they downplay differences to the extent that this promotes a notion of equality, right? That men and women can accomplish the same kinds of things. So during the 1960s into the 1970s, radical feminists looked to establish organizations according to women's values and use their operating principles, right? And so many of the organizations that arose out of this movement were known as collectives. So the academic Joyce Roseshield Witt studied and enumerated many of the features of collectivist organizations. So, or at least the principles by which they were supposed to operate, right? And so the idea is that authority resides in the collective. So authority is vested in everyone in the organization, not just one leader, right? There's a minimal stipulation of rules, so rules aren't laid out in an authoritarian way. Social control, so when control is exercised, it's based on mutually shared values instead of supervision, right? It's based on the idea that social relations are personal and of value in and of themselves. That recruitment and advancement based on friends and shared values is preferable to that based on training and certification. Power should be spread out in a fair manner, right? And that the division of labor should be minimized, and the separation of mental work and manual work should also be minimized, right? So when you think about it, according to the old power structures or the old way of doing things, we of course make a big separation between mental and manual forms of labor, right? And oddly, mental labor, which is arguably a hell of a lot easier, is usually rewarded financially at a higher rate than actual hard physical work. Right? Now, of course, there are critiques of radical feminism as well. So one of the critiques is that radical feminism takes what we call an essentialist approach. So women are valued for or are seen as their natural characteristics. So when we, the idea behind forming these collectives and some of these other things, the egalitarian spread of power, the non-stipulation of rules, and so on, is based on characteristics that are traditionally associated with women: caring, nurturance, etc. Right, and that they view these as superior to masculine tendencies of rationality, independence, hierarchy, and individualism. Now, of course, there's also a separatist approach that is critiqued as well, right? Which is the idea that women can only fully realize their possibilities through the creation of social structures and institutions free from patriarchal ideology. So these would, the critique is that radical feminists are taking a separatist approach to the extent that they just want women-only organizations. And so many people say, listen, that's not really fair or reasonable either. And we also found over time that organizations that did take this separatist approach often failed. And these failures have been linked to the fact that they have to be connected to other organizations as well as their environment, right? An organization has to be open to some extent. We talked about open and closed systems in a previous chapter. And closed organizations are subject to greater levels of entropy, right? Entropy comes more quickly than it does for open systems. And so when you have a closed system that's for women and by women, the idea is that, listen, if you don't interact with the world and you're not an open org, then things will fall apart rather quickly. Now, the third kind or third mode of feminism we'll talk about here today is critical feminism. And this is arguably a more enlightened view of feminism and gender than what we've seen in the past. So specifically, critical feminism maintains that gender is neither an individual variable nor a natural stable feature of women and men. Instead, gender is socially constructed, and ideas of gender are subject to change. So I should note, when we talk about gender here, we're not talking about sex. Gender and sex are two different things, according to this way of thinking. So when we're talking about gender, we're talking about ideas of what's masculine and what's feminine. When you're talking about sex, you're talking about what you got on you, like what's between your legs. It's the physical makeup of a person, as opposed to gender, which is a socially constructed notion of how men act and how women act. So critical feminists also say then that gender can't be separated from organizational life and studied apart from it, right? They argue that gender is part of every single facet of the organization, and you can't get away from it, right? Indeed, gender is a structural feature of organizations rather than just a simple characteristic of individuals. Moreover, they argue that we're always doing gender. You're always acting out gender, and that indeed this performance of gender is key to your identity. So we're always, in some sense, acting in ways that are either masculine or feminine. So part of what enables this constant process is what we call gender accountability. And the notion of gender accountability maintains that each of us is held accountable for adequate performance of masculinity and femininity, with each performance being judged in terms of the social context in which it occurs. So, what this is maintaining is that we're always acting out our gender in some way or another, and that people are critiquing it, right? I mean, we know that there are, whether or not we want to admit it, we can observe that there are ways of acting and behaving that we would characterize as feminine, right? And ways that might be characterized as masculine. And so society critiques us on this, right? I mean, this is what a lot of the uproar is about, with celebrities dressing their male children in dresses and things like this, right? People are like, oh, that's wrong. Well, that's gender accountability. That's that judgment is an attempt to hold these celebrities accountable for dressing their child in a way that's not in accordance with traditional ideas of masculinity, right? So the critical feminist perspective then conceives as gender as an ongoing accomplishment, a process that's performed by both women and men. Now, in theory, this enables a close look at relationships between gender, organizational communication, and power. And through this close look, right, critical feminists would say that the groups who have the most, what they found is that the groups who have the most power and resources have the most influence on the way gender identities are constructed. So the people with the most power and resources get the most say about how people should act according to gender and how they construct their identities, right? So this goes back to Marx and Marxism, which is part of the reason we call this critical feminism. It goes back to Marx's famous idea and famous saying that the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas, right? Okay, that's it for this short lecture. For the third one, we'll talk more about masculinity.